The images we have just seen portray the civil war that took place in the frozen territory of Russia between 1917 and 1923. On one side, the communist insurrection. On the other, the troops loyal to the tsars. The Romanov dynasty was, without a doubt, one of the most extraordinary in the modern era. For more than 3 centuries, these monarchs, known in Russia as tsars and tsarinas, built an empire that extended over 1/6 of the Earth's surface, consolidating their dominion as one of the largest the world has ever known. However, with the Russian Revolution and after a brutal civil war, Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks put an end to the hegemony of the Romanovs, ending the aspirations of their powerful empire. But what would the 20th century, and therefore our present, have been like without this social revolt? What would have been the fate of Hitler and Nazism? How would the world have changed without the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union? 2 nuclear superpowers playing the apocalypse. In this military history video, we invite you to embark on an alternative journey, an exercise in futurology and speculative scenarios that, although they may seem implausible, are only the result of the capricious dance of chance. Put on your helmet and climb aboard this time machine. Let's get started.
Everything that happened in the 20th century happened really because of the Russian Revolution. The idea of revolution itself, the whole experiment in socialism, indeed the counterface of that, Nazism and fascism as a counter-revolution against Bolshevism. So the Second World War. So the Cold War that follows from the division that results directly from 1917.
As we have seen in this excerpt, the Russian Revolution changed the course of world history irrevocably, resonating to this day. To understand this phenomenon, we must first understand the regime that ruled the fate of this gigantic territory for 3 centuries, which the revolution overthrew, the Russian Empire. For example, the controversial Vladimir Putin, the current president of the country, does not hide his admiration for Peter the Great, one of the most imposing and famous tsars of the Romanov dynasty. The history of that royal house is fundamental to understanding the nature of the nation, from its origins to the present day. It was a dynasty marked by brutality and excess, a lineage where cruelty was commonplace. Peter the Great did not hesitate to murder his own son to secure his legacy. Catherine the Great, in her ruthless rise to power, eliminated her husband without hesitation. And Alexander I, embroiled in a sea of conspiracies, had no qualms about murdering his own father. As we can see, the history of the Romanovs is a dark saga of betrayal and violence, a somber tale of power and decadence. This empire, so ostentatious and tyrannical, quickly gained enemies throughout history, which would lead to its inevitable collapse.
The turn of the 20th century would be marked by a series of military defeats and economic turmoil that would shake the foundations of the Russian Empire and her Romanov rulers. Japan's humiliation of the ostensibly much stronger Russia in the 1904 Russo-Japanese War caught the attention of many Russians, who saw this defeat as a metaphor for the failures of the Romanov dynasty. In 1905, a first popular revolt raged through the massive Russian Empire. This liberal revolution would ultimately be silenced, but not without minor reforms.
In this way, a spark of rebellion against the established order would be introduced into the hearts of the Russian people. Here we can begin to speculate. Perhaps if the Romanovs had not fallen into disgrace, Russia would have had several decades of palace intrigues, which would have been aired weekly in the gossip magazines. However, in that violent period that led to the revolution, the news was very different.
In 1900, 50% of the empire's children died before age 5. Russia's small middle class was in better health, but starving for political freedom. A government official bragged, "There is no citizen who can rest assured that his home won't be searched and he himself won't be arrested."
There was huge discontent with this repressive system, but there was no mechanism for most of these individuals to try to change the system from within.
The dynasty's end would come as dramatically as its rise. Nicholas II, the last Tsar, ascended the throne on November 1, 1894, amid a Russia gripped by discontent. Known as a weak and indecisive man, he attempted to maintain control over an empire crumbling under the weight of its own greatness. Nicholas II's attempts to preserve absolute power proved calamitous. Defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, which raged from 1904 to 1905, and the military disaster of World War I, which raged from 1914 to 1918, further eroded his people's faith in the monarchy. While peasants were starving and soldiers were falling at the front, the ruling court was immersed in mysticism. The latter concentrated on the enigmatic figure of Rasputin, a monk of humble origins whose influence on the czars led them to isolate themselves from the people, contributing to the disintegration of the regime. It is likely that, had Nicholas II not been overthrown by the communists, the Russian Empire would possibly have evolved into a parliamentary monarchy, similar to those that already existed in many European nations. In fact, between 1905 and 1906, the country was one step away from this change when the Tsar granted a constitution and established the Duma, a parliament elected by the people. Although this seemed to be the beginning of a new era, the fate of the empire took a different course.
As famines ravaged the hinterland, soldiers began deserting en masse. They would turn their attention in the opposite direction, taking their weapons to the Russian capital of Petrograd in a bid to secure better living conditions for the Russian people. The situation rapidly became untenable. It would not be long until soldiers and striking workers seized control of the capital and demanded the formation of a more democratic government.
In the autumn of 1917, as icy winds swept through the streets of Petrograd, history was preparing to take a violent and decisive turn. World War I was ravaging the nation. Soldiers were dying by the thousands at the front, while in the cities, hunger and despair gripped civilians. Into this climate of chaos and disintegration, a man who had been battling the empire from the shadows emerged, determined to change the fate of Russia and the world once and for all: Vladimir Lenin. This revolutionary with a striking oratory had spent years in hiding, watching the old order crumble. The time to act had come. Lenin returned to Russia on the 16th of April 1917, bringing with him a ruthless vision. The communist revolution could not simply be a change of government, but a total transformation of society, a break with centuries of oppression and inequality. On November 7, 1917, Lenin and his small group of Bolsheviks launched a daring attack. With military precision and brutal determination, they took strategic points in St. Petersburg, train stations, post offices, and the crucial Winter Palace, symbol of imperial power. The royal guards, exhausted and demoralized, offered little resistance. The administration that had ruled Russia for centuries collapsed in a matter of hours. On July 17, 1918, the last of the Tsars, Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, their 5 children and some servants were shot by a firing squad of Bolsheviks. After that cold, dark night of revolution, Lenin not only became an icon of international communism and changed the destiny of Russia, but also the course of history itself. Although perhaps, if the revolution had not prospered, the one who would surely have been shot would have been Vladimir Lenin himself.
The execution of Tsar Nicholas and his family cratered white morale, but also rallied anti-Bolshevik sentiment in the white-controlled areas. Many moderates rose to condemn the brutal killing of the imperial family and painted Lenin as a tyrant and murderer. Ironically, not long thereafter, the Bolshevik leader would face a similar fate. In the summer of 1918, Lenin toured an arms factory in Moscow. When he approached the crowd to shake hands, a smiling woman reached out to him, drew a revolver, and shot Lenin through the chest.
This is the first moment when we begin to learn about our alternative history. Let us imagine that this attempt was carried out, but not in the summer of 1918, but a year earlier, precisely with the return of Lenin in April 1917. Without his presence, it is very likely that the communist revolution would not have taken place. In that case, Russia could have emerged as the bastion of conservative monarchies, opposing the liberal democracies of Western Europe. Perhaps instead of World War II or the Cold War, we would have witnessed more conventional imperialist combats. Russia, in this alternative scenario, might have fragmented into sub-states led by the different dominant ethnic groups that coexisted in the empire, unless the process of Russification had been sufficiently aggressive and effective. The European Union and NATO, perhaps, would never have existed. It would be a radically different world from the one we know. However, even though the revolution had not been realized after Lenin's death, the people would continue to suffer hunger and face inequality in the streets, which would direct the course of history to a different popular uprising, with other protagonists, but with the same transformative drive.
When Tsarist troops faced off against the women demanding bread on the streets of Petrograd. It looked like 1905 all over again, but this time, something snapped. Most soldiers refused to fire, and then some took aim and shot their officers.
So they've now mutinied and killed their officers in wartime.
Originally born as simple workers and soldiers' councils, the Soviets quickly evolved into the main opposition to Tsarist forces within this new fragmented Russian state. The process was as rapid as it was turbulent. In factories and barracks, workers and soldiers began to organize their own councils, demanding participation in decisions and control over the conditions that governed their lives. What began as small local groups soon transformed into a powerful network that extended throughout the country.
Soldiers' wives, teenaged factory workers, sailors, and waiters were only a few of the groups that formed Soviets, began to organize, and demanded their rights.
What had begun as a lightning coup by the Soviets to seize power quickly escalated into a devastating civil war that swept across Russia. The fighting had only just begun, and the entire country would soon become a battlefield. This conflict galvanized the Bolsheviks, even in Lenin's absence. Initially, they were paralyzed by his death, but gradually this surprising event became a driving force that further intensified their fierce and ruthless struggle. These elements created the ideal breeding ground for a coup attempt to begin to loom on the horizon, led by General Laver Kornilov.
However, after the military coup was foiled, Bolshevik soldiers refused orders by the government to stand down. Instead, sensing weakness, the communists launched a coup of their own.
As you can see, even after Lenin's death, the path of revolution continued unabated. The Bolsheviks were now led by Major Leon Trotsky. Determined to consolidate the revolt, they deployed their Red Army, a force that became professionalized in the heat of battle. A brilliant and charismatic strategist, Trotsky used armored trains to travel across the vast Russian territory, infusing discipline and revolutionary fervor into the troops. In parallel, the anti-Bolsheviks formed the White Movement, a heterogeneous coalition of czarists, nobles, liberals, and moderate socialists, united by a common hatred of the communists. But the Whites lacked the unity and clear purpose of their enemies. Fragmented and without a strong leader, their offensives, while powerful at times, lacked the coherence necessary to defeat Trotsky. Despite the support of foreign powers such as Britain, France, the United States, and Japan, who saw in the Whites an opportunity to crush the nascent communist power, their efforts were hampered by internal rivalries and disastrous logistics. In this instance, the Tsars could have escaped Russia before it was too late, taking refuge in Germany to reorganize the forces still loyal to them. What would have happened to Hitler then? In his early days, this young German soldier would have been enthralled by the pure blood of the Romanov dynasty until he realized that it was not Aryan enough. This quick romance and subsequent falling out of love would only further strengthen his racist ideology. For Hitler, no matter how close he was to a Russian, there was nothing like German blood. On the other hand, if the empire had had a different ending, the Chinese Communist Party, without the material, logistical, and strategic support of the Soviet Union, would not have been able to consolidate its own revolution, thus altering the historical course not only of China, but of all of Asia. Sounds incredible, right? If the dynasty had not been overthrown, the present would be very different, and many of the pages of the past would have to be completely rewritten. What would have become of the fate of the Russian Empire if it had maintained its participation in the First World War until the end? Without a doubt, the pressure from the people to desist from involvement in the conflict would have been intolerable for the government. Let us remember that while the world conflict in Europe escalated, the Civil War was destroying the heart of Russia. Entire cities changed hands in a matter of days, and the peasants caught in the middle suffered the weight of the battles. But the conflict was not limited to the fight between the Reds and the Whites. There were also peasant revolts, anarchist uprisings such as that in Ukraine, and a brutal war in eastern Siberia, where Admiral Kolchak attempted to establish a rival government. Every corner of Russia was drawn into the conflict, and the country spiraled into violence.
Now that the playing field had been leveled, white forces rallied around several key individuals leading troops against the Bolshevik menace.
The Tsars still had enough support for a counterattack, but their absence from the country fostered a state of equal parts anarchy and hope. At these key moments, one man emerged in the formation of a new provisional government, Alexander Guchkov. This politician and businessman, known for his intelligence and ambition, became a central figure in the effort to stabilize the country and build a new democratic order. The duality of power, with the communists gaining influence and challenging the authority of the provisional government, further complicated the situation. The Soviets were becoming a formidable challenge, exerting parallel control and eroding the authority of Guchkov's government. As the nation thrashed in internal crisis, Russia would likely be forced to accept the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed in March 1918, and withdraw from World War I, leaving a bitter legacy of humiliation that would be remembered as one of the greatest defeats of the new Bolshevik regime.
The victorious provisional government was reassembled under Alexander Guchkov, who became Russia's first president. But while one war had ended, another still loomed. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed between Germany and the Bolsheviks, not the white government. This meant, technically, Russia and Germany were still at war. White Russia's preoccupation with her civil war had seen German interest directed westward for most of the latter half of the war, first to break the Entente outside Paris, and then to guard against the unprecedented French syndicalist revolution.
If we imagine an alternative path of history, without civil war, what would have happened to the shaky power of the Tsars? It is possible that the regime would have behaved similarly to countries like Italy and Romania, where the monarchs remained on the throne, while real power was exercised by a military dictatorship. This scenario, where one faction takes control of the state while the Tsar takes a symbolic role, could have led to a military regime rebuilding the power of the old empire. It would have eventually led to Russia's expansion into the Imperial lands in an effort to regain its lost greatness. But in our parallel history, with the Tsar still alive, would civil war still have occurred?
At the bottom of society, a radicalization is taking place as the war becomes worse and worse for Russia. At the same time, at the top of society, you have the moderate classes, the middle classes and the nobles and so forth, becoming more and more upset by this radicalization, and they become more conservative. So what you get is a pulling apart of society, a polarization, a real class struggle, the bottom against the top.
As in the original story, by the summer of 1920, the collapse of the whites became imminent. Bolshevik forces, with a combination of aggressive tactics and a ruthless ability to crush resistance, captured the last important positions of their enemies. The white leaders, exhausted and demoralized, were caught between the advancing forces of the Red Army and the relentless pressure of civil war.
By 1925, Russia's troubles had only worsened, as inflation truly spiraled beyond control. Economic ties to the United States, once a source of strength, quickly became a liability, as the Wall Street crash sent the American economy stumbling. Soon, the Russian government found itself forced to turn to the hated Germans for aid, a situation epitomized by the 1926 Vilnius Agreement. The agreement provided a framework for broad German investment across Russia, which would pave the way for industrialization yet unseen in the country.
In this alternative history, the tsars were mysteriously assassinated in an ambush on the streets of Berlin in late 1925. It was never known for certain who had ordered the killing of the empire's leaders, although unofficial history points the finger at a figure as luminous as he was dark, Joseph Stalin. He was said to have been the mastermind behind the assassination. Stalin's rise to power was an unexpected revelation. Although at first his role as General Secretary of the Communist Party seemed merely administrative, it became the springboard that allowed him to consolidate extraordinary power. After the early death of his friend Lenin, who by our imagination died in 1918 and not 1924, Stalin emerged as the main contender in the struggle for leadership. His ability to negotiate and settle political disputes led him to surpass figures such as Leon Trotsky, who had served as Lenin's right-hand man until his death. Stalin's rapid seizure of power may have allowed him to gain an advantage over military contenders like the United States and Germany. Perhaps, just perhaps, Stalin would have imposed his war machine, subjugating the other powers of the day, and thus we would have been spared World War II. Too much imagination. Stalin's rapid industrialization not only consolidated the communist bloc, but also established a regime that would rule with an iron fist for more than 7 decades, ushering in a new era in Russian and world history. This epochal change came at an unimaginable cost. Some 7 million dead, a devastated country, and a deeply divided society. But the Bolshevik regime, despite its rise through fire and blood, emerged as the hegemonic force that would shape the future of Russia and the 20th century. As in real history, Stalin did not stop until he had concentrated all governmental power. His tactics included a series of large-scale purges within his ranks. As the country reeled from reforms and internal strife, Stalin used his control of the party to eliminate rivals and consolidate his rule.
One of the 20th century's great monsters, Stalin was responsible for some 20 million deaths of his own people and untold numbers of ruined lives.
There are many people who think that Stalinism was the natural, inevitable outgrowth of 1917. That revolution itself must contain within it terror, violence, dictatorship.
Political repression became brutal and ruthless, creating a climate of fear in which even former allies could become dangerous enemies. The Soviet Union was establishing itself as a world power and adapting to a new order under Stalin's absolute control. But that is another story. Today's Russia, under the leadership of Vladimir Putin, seeks to emulate these historical figures, reflecting both imperial majesty and Soviet authoritarianism. To understand Russia's present, the Kremlin's geopolitical decisions, and even the war in Ukraine requires knowing the peculiar history of the Romanovs, a dynasty that suffered a formidable rise and a rapid fall, but whose legacy continues to be important in the present. Finally, to end our journey into an alternative past, let's continue with the timeline. Perhaps without the threat of communism, the Nazi Party would not have had a meteoric rise to power in Germany. Given this, World War II might never have happened, and perhaps the development of the atomic bomb would have been considerably delayed. These are some of the mental exercises we can do, but there are surely many others. How do you imagine history would have changed if the Russian Empire had not collapsed? Leave your comments below this video. Thank you for following us to the end. We look forward to seeing you in another installment of Military History. See you next time.